The international environment we are in has bred considerable comment, both favorable and otherwise, at home and abroad about U.S. foreign policy. I hope all of us in this room agree that the United States is the global leader, albeit somewhat less than a few decades ago. Our country remains the only truly global power. You and I think, believe that our leadership is needed to diffuse tension, build consensus, solve problems, resolve conflict throughout the world. My thought about this conference is that its panelists and speakers should focus on the question of how we should lead. In the day-to-day world of policy making, the effort has to be made to find the right way to deal with the immediate problems we have. I learned that lesson the hard way. I gave once a grandiose statement on America's role in the world in the cabinet room when LBJ was president. When I finished, the president turned to me and said, "Lee, that's a nice, fancy speech you just gave, but what do I do now?" After that, I never went to the White House without preparing for that question, and it came with great frequency. So the operative question to address is how, not whether, how we exercise American leadership. In specific terms, how do we use American power to get China to change its policy towards North Korea? Or how do we get and use American power to change Pakistan's view on Afghanistan? And the list goes on. Before we begin formally in the program, I want to recognize the men and women from our military services who defend our nation and its values. Your actions should make you feel good and the rest of us feel appreciative. You contribute to the freedom, stability, and strength of our state and nation. So I ask the military veterans in the audience to stand so that we may greet them with our applause. Thank you very much. To tell us more now about the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, I welcome, if I can find her, where is she? Oh, right over here. Liz Schreier, the President, CEO for the Global Leadership Coalition. Liz, we're delighted to have you in Indiana.
Well, thank you, Congressman Hamilton. As someone just said, any day that we are all lucky enough to spend with the Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, Lee Hamilton, is a great day. Please, everybody, go ahead and enjoy and begin your lunch as we kick off what is going to be a fabulous program. I have to say, I know all of us hearts and prayers are with our fellow citizens in Houston as they deal with such difficult tragedy, but it brings me to the conversation we have today of whether it is an earthquake in Haiti, a tsunami in Indonesia, or the horrifying floods that are going on in Houston. I'm always so blessed and proud that we are Americans and reach out to our fellow citizens, and I know you join me as well. There are so so many thank yous as I kick off, not only Lee Hamilton and Dick Lugar, who co-chair the Indiana Advisory Committee, but so many of you who are walking around with a little red tag that says Indiana Advisory Committee. Thank you to you. Thank you to our partners that help put today's event on, and to what we call our global impact partners, who are the companies that help put programs like this on all over the country. I am so looking forward to Ambassador Lee Feinstein, John Ellenberger from Land O'Lakes, who are going to join me on the program in just a little bit, and I am excited to hear from you. Senator Todd Young, how privileged I get to see you in Washington, but to be here with you in your home state. I think everybody here knows, but if you don't know, you have a rock star in the making. Senator Young, you've only been in the Senate for a little bit, but the impact on so many issues, but particularly on the ones we're going to talk about today, are unmatched, whether it is raising the awareness on famine crisis or ensuring that there are the resources that we need in development and diplomacy. You embody what we're going to talk about, America's global leadership, and the mission of our organization, which I'll talk about, building a better, safer world. So everybody, please thank Senator Todd Young for being here, and we're going to very excited to learn from you today. So I have to tell you, I told a few, I'm from the Midwest, so I love being back here. I love being in Indiana. My son was a Hoosier, graduated a few years ago. He is so jealous that I'm here today. But one of the reasons I love is not only does your senator get it, but your young people get it. And where is Margaret Hedgewood? Where's Margaret? There's Margaret. You have to get to know her. Because let me tell you a quick story about Margaret. Until about a year ago, Margaret had never given much thought to international development. And frankly, as she told me, she thought farming was behind the times, because she was much more interested in her studies, which are biological engineering and biotechnology, nothing that I know anything about at Purdue University. But thanks to Land O'Lakes, who has a program about emerging leaders fellowship, Margaret was exposed to an entirely new way to think about how she could use innovation and technology in agriculture. And as part of her internship, she traveled to Tanzania, traveled to South Africa, and saw firsthand that even the best medicines can only go so far if you don't have basic nutrition. And she learned something that I didn't know, but that the average American cow produces 10 times more milk than a Tanzania cow, and then inspired her enough to do this. For Margaret to take an entire different track in her career, to go into international development with her engineering career, and she is now working on ways to not only improve access to food in the world, but also to make sure that people have proper nutrition so they can live a healthy life. So Margaret, on behalf of all of us, we are so proud and inspired of the commitment that you are also engaging your classmates to make a world of difference. And that is exactly, I think, what this conversation is about, is to find people like you who want to make a difference in the world. So Margaret, thanks for being with us. So whether young or a tad a little bit older than Margaret, I think today's discussion about America's global leadership is so critical, because in a 24/7 hyper-competitive news cycle, every single issue is scrutinized. And we get asked every day in Washington why, on every issue, as you should. And for us at USGLC, we get asked why we need global leadership, America's global leadership. What's the return on investment? And about a month ago, I had the opportunity to testify before about a dozen senators. And like most of these testimonies, you get just a few moments to try to explain. And in a few moments, I had explained what are the consequences and the stakes if America pulled back in the world. What would it mean if the proposals that were on the table to cut the State Department, the USAID, foreign assistance by a third, what would that mean to our country? So I gave them 3 numbers that I want to share with you to give a sense of what this means. First number, 20 million. 20 million. That's the number of people at risk in an unprecedented famine crisis that Senator Young has been raising the alarm bells about. It's a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable magnitude, but it's also a national security risk, because all 4 countries, Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria harbor terrorist groups from Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and ISIS. The second number I raised was 65 million. That's the number of refugees and displaced people around the world, the largest number since World War II, half of whom are women and children. Yes, a human tragedy of enormous concern, but once again, a national security concern when you're destabilizing consequences for frontline countries like Jordan. And the third number I talked about was 320 million. That's the number of Americans that are exposed to the next Ebola, 6.6 million who are from Indiana. And we have to think about what happens if we're not investing in the health systems around the world, and whether we're prepared for prevent the next pandemic from spreading. So that's what the nature of USGLC is about, to convene groups like this with a wide array of different voices to talk about America's global leadership. We're known around town as the Strange Bedfellow Coalition because we bring unique voices together. We're over 500 businesses and humanitarian organizations and faith leaders who come together about the importance of civilian tools that make a difference in the world. Our network spans around the country, coast to coast, Maine to Texas, North Dakota to Georgia, right here in Indiana. We have a national advisory committee led by General Colin Powell. It has a huge group of experts in the national security arena, including every former living Secretary of State, from Henry Kissinger through John Kerry and all those in between. We're very proud of an ever-growing voice in the military community. We have almost 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals. We lost one in January, Jim Mattis, who went, of course, into the administration as Secretary of Defense. But they're joined by over 30,000 veterans, many of whom stood up so wonderfully today. And the people in this room are kind of a microcosm of what we see at USGLC events around the country. Eli Lilly to Indiana University, Democrats, Republicans, independents, business leaders, and faith leaders who want to improve the lives of those around the country. We educate about why these strategic investments in development and diplomacy make a difference, and we advocate for something known as the International Affairs Budget. It's about 1% of the budget. A lot of people call it the foreign aid budget, but frankly, it's so much more. It's our Peace Corps volunteers. It's our diplomats around the world. It is those healthcare workers that battle the Ebola crisis in West Africa. It is the programs that open markets for our goods and services. And the good news is that they actually work. In the last 2 decades, we have the number of people living in extreme poverty, living in $1.25 a day, has actually been cut in half. And that's about 1 billion people. So let me end with a little secret. Senator Young knows this well, that a lot of people say Washington is broken. And there's days that, for those of us who live in Washington, it feels it. But there's one issue that is really bringing bipartisan support together. And it's around the issue of international affairs budget and programs around development and diplomacy. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. This year, when those proposals to cut 32% from the State Department and USAID came, from the Freedom Caucus to the Progressive Caucus, we saw a call to protect these funds. Senator Young had a bipartisan letter just on these very issues. Last Congress, when not a lot was getting done, there was an unbelievable, stunning 8 pieces of bipartisan legislation just on global development that all got passed into law. So bipartisan work is hard, but sometimes it's not hard when it comes to the international relations and when it comes to global development. But if you don't believe me, take a look at this.
Some say Washington is broken.
That our country is just hopelessly divided.
But let's be honest, people like to exaggerate.
No.
Yes.
The truth is, there's a lot that still brings us together.
Both Republicans and Democrats.
Democrats and Republicans.
A consistent bipartisan effort.
To help lift people out of poverty around the world.
In the last 2 years, Congress passed significant pieces of legislation
that strengthened American global leadership,
advance our economic interest,
make us more secure, and champion our values.
How about the Water for the World Act?
It promotes safe, clean drinking water for 1 billion people around the world.
not bad.
Or the Girls Count Act.
That's going to ensure that girls around the world are protected
from trafficking and exploitation,
allowing them to get the education they deserve.
And that can be game-changing.
Together, we crafted and passed the Electrify Africa Act.
This bill is a step toward fulfilling America's promise to reach 50 million people in Africa and create
30,000 megawatts of generation capacity.
Now that's powerful.
That's huge. The Global Food Security Act is a big one.
We are tackling the root causes of hunger through America's Feed the Future initiative.
And already lifting millions of farmers out of poverty.
And providing millions of children nutritional support.
We joined together to pass the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act.
That bill ensures an even greater return on investment for the American taxpayer.
It's a big win for this small
but strategic 1% of the budget.
I voted for that.
I voted for that.
I voted for that.
I voted for that too.
And so did every one of my colleagues.
every
Single
One.
We even got a little wild.
No, not that kind of wild.
We got the End Wildlife Trafficking Act into the end zone.
That's END, eliminate, neutralize, and disrupt wildlife trafficking.
That law helps cut off billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars to the terrorist organizations from the illegal wildlife trade.
And we just voted for the End Modern Slavery Initiative Act.
A powerful step towards ending sex and labor enslavement for good.
that moves more than 27 million people.
In 165 countries.
closer to freedom.
Yeah, I'd say broken is perhaps a bit overstated.
We're getting things done for the American people and for the world.
Clean water,
Rights for women and girls.
Energy infrastructure.
Food security.
Preventing wildlife trafficking.
Thwarting terrorists.
Ending modern slavery.
It all adds up.
It all serves to make our nation safer.
And stronger.
I'm not saying we don't disagree on a few things.
But at the end of the day,
we're working together for our country.
To build a better, safer, and more prosperous world.
And that is something we can all be proud of.
What a powerful video. Many of you in this room have had the opportunity. We've traveled together and experienced a lot of mission work around the world, and this sends a powerful message. Good morning. My name is Jeff Cardwell, and I'm the founder of the People Helping People Network. I'm honored to be here today on behalf of USGLC's Indiana Advisory Committee, and as a member of this coalition who personally believes the prompting of global development is central to demonstrating American values and advancing our interest around the world. Today, United States is providing foreign assistance in new and more effective ways than ever before, and the People Helping People Network is just one of many American organizations working tirelessly to make the world a better and safer place. Strategic investments in these programs are critical to tackling global challenges like poverty, substandard housing, hunger, health, and disease. And when organizations like mine partner with governmental agencies and U.S. businesses, incredible things start to happen. From offering life-saving medical treatment to teaching girls and boys to read and write, ensuring access to clean water, and providing relief after disasters, when America leads, we all win. We do this because it is the American way, and to be honest, it just makes good sense. I know that Jim and other members of our business community here today agree. Jim?
Thank you, Jeff. I'm Jim Morris. I'm Vice Chairman of the Indiana Pacers and the Indiana Fever. And everything you said in the video and everything you said, Jeff and Liz, I agree with. I'm a proud member of the USGLC Indiana Advisory Committee, and I'm here this morning on behalf of many large and small Indiana businesses in our state who know that our local economy inextricably linked with the economic concerns of the rest of the world. 95% of the world's consumers are outside our national borders. And today's fastest growing markets are in the developing world. It cannot be overstated that these are the markets of the future and tomorrow. In order to advance American interests in these markets, we rely on the strategic investments in diplomacy and economic development to do what private business cannot do, to help fight corruption, to promote the rule of law, and open markets for American goods and services. At my company, we know that 1 in 5 American jobs are tied to international trade, and that 1/3 of all manufacturing jobs in the United States are directly tied to our state's exports. And by the way, the Pacers have 70% of our Facebook contacts come from outside the United States of America, and that number exceeds 4 million. Forgive my crass commercialism. We understand that the critical programs funded by the International Affairs budget help to keep America competitive in the global marketplace, which is key to our economic prosperity here at home. I know that our guest speakers today share this understanding. It's my pleasure to introduce 2 of the speakers who will be on the panel, and then to introduce our keynote speaker. On the panel this afternoon is Ambassador Lee Feinstein. This remarkable man, rapidly becoming a Hoosier, is the founding dean of the Global Studies program at Indiana University, was the United States ambassador to Poland, and a key foreign policy advisor to President Obama and Madeleine Albright. This is an extraordinary person that has come to lead Indiana University's effort to prepare its students for a broad, effective role in the world, be it in business, in diplomacy, in military, in the Peace Corps, whatever the choice might be. And I should tell you that Indiana University has the finest Russian studies program in the country, the top Jewish studies program in the country, teaches 80 foreign languages, more than any university in the United States, and the list goes on and on and on. It is extraordinary, and it is so important. There is not a graduate of Indiana University that does not need to be prepared for a role in the world. Certainly to understand the difficulties and the challenges and the opportunities we have in our country. And I could make the same case for Purdue University. As chairman of the Board of Trustees of Indiana University, I won't do that. But Purdue, this remarkable school of agriculture, won 3 of the World Food Prizes in the last 10 years. It's extraordinary what we Hoosiers have in academic life going for us. I'm also pleased to introduce to you John Ellenberger. John is a senior vice president with Land O'Lakes, headquartered in the Twin Cities. When I was head of the World Food Program, we did so much work with Land O'Lakes. And Land O'Lakes is a company like Eli Lilly, a company that will always do the right thing as it understands it. And there is not a company in the world that has a better humanitarian's heart than Land O'Lakes. They honor the public trust and do it superbly well. So, John, welcome to Indiana. You are good enough to be a Hoosier. Liz, we've heard from you, your wonderful record leading this effort, but your work for many years bringing folks together and helping Americans to understand the opportunities and that we have in front of us and the importance of standing up to the plate and going at it. It's now, by the way, to be in the same room with Lee Hamilton, and I just know Dick Lugar's here in spirit, but to think that our state produced these two extraordinary statesmen, good friends, that led the Congress for between 30 and 40 years on international affairs, for them both to be Hoosiers is special. And Lee is full-time with Indiana University, spending time every day with students. And Dick Lugar occupies the IU office in Washington and is back and forth to Bloomington, his office, as he can get here. Senator Todd Young, this is extraordinary. Served 6 years in the House and now 6 months in the Senate, was selected to serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And the quick start he has exhibited in the Senate with an incredible humanitarian's heart. Just a couple of months after he was in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee, he gathered together 10 senators from the Foreign Relations Committee, both parties, and said this hunger, this tragedy in Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, Liz told us 20 million people at risk of losing their lives is just unacceptable. And it's unacceptable for America not to stand forward. Our country does a better job of separating the world's humanitarian concerns from the world's political concerns. And we can't let 20 million people die, and that's the result if they're not fed. But Todd got the Senate colleagues together and wrote a letter, a brilliant letter for a young senator. And he took that letter to Rex Tillerson, and he said, "Sir, we need your help, and we're willing to stand there with you, and we're willing to provide the leadership." So to have this young guy, brilliantly educated at the Naval Academy, MBA from the University of Chicago, a degree from the University of London, and then superbly capping it off as a graduate of the Indiana University School of Law. This guy is special. And this guy has a heart for those who are sad, lonely, vulnerable, and at risk. And he will provide incredible leadership at bringing people together. There is no Republican, Democrat separate view of people who are hurting. And nothing tells the world more vividly about who we are as a country than our support for the world's humanitarian agenda. So, Senator, we're proud of you. We're really proud of you. And to have somebody your age off to such a brilliant start, I can only imagine the difference you're going to make in the lives of so many for so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. I have nothing else. I accept that endorsement. Thank you. Yeah. Goodness, you really piled it on thick there. I'm so grateful for that generous introduction. I will work tirelessly to live up to that standard you set for me. It is so encouraging to hear from our respected community leaders who have also been in their time global leaders. It's encouraging to be here with all of you, our distinguished guests, from government, from business, from our not-for-profits, concerned citizens, global scholars. It's really humbling to be up here. Most especially, it's humbling for me to be in the presence of Chairman Hamilton, who, as many others have mentioned, has served our country with distinction in so many ways. Thanks so much to you, Chairman, and to Senator Lugar for co-chairing Indiana's U.S. Global Leadership Coalition Advisory Committee. And Liz, thank you for your very important work, and to USGLC. We're grateful you'd host this event, and to all the sponsors who helped make this event possible. So the title of today's event is America's Role in the World: Why Leading Globally Matters for Indiana. Now, I realize by virtue of being associated with USGLC, I'm sort of preaching to the proverbial choir. Most of you already know why American and international leadership is good for our country, good for the state of Indiana. But allow me to briefly describe a few principles that guide my thinking on the issue. First, if we're to keep America safe and prosperous at home, we must remain engaged. We must lead abroad. Today, threats such as terrorism, pandemics, cyber threats, and so forth don't respect borders. These threats are as diverse and serious as any in memory. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans don't afford the protection they once did, just a few years ago, in fact. As a result, we cannot best protect our citizens if we pretend America is an isolated fortress. We can't pull up the drawbridge and hide behind the moat, if you will. The tragic events of 2001, 9/11, underscored that, once again, what happens in other countries can impact us here at home. In other words, the transnational threats we confront require the U.S. to proactively work with other countries rather than trying to go it alone. But it's not just our security that demands U.S. international leadership and engagement, as important as that is. It's our economic interests as well. As someone just said, approximately 95% of consumers are outside of the United States. Over 800,000 Hoosiers' jobs are tied to international trade. We Hoosiers export more than $35 billion a year to foreign markets. Now, U.S. international leadership and engagement isn't just about security and prosperity alone. There's still more to it than that. It's also about doing good. Our nation is at its best when we help feed the hungry, when we protect the vulnerable, when we speak out for political prisoners, when we assist those who seek to enjoy the universal human rights that sometimes we take for granted. Undoubtedly, our federal government is responsible to the American people, to our own security, to our own prosperity, and that's been emphasized a lot by our nation's leaders in recent months and years. There's also no doubt that we should look for our foreign partners to contribute, and I would say contribute more, as the United States cannot help everyone. But we should not use these realities as an excuse to avoid leading, engaging, and helping where we can. That would be neglecting a moral imperative, and it would be short-sighted. Now, here's why. In my experience and my observation, when America deliberately and thoughtfully seeks to do good internationally, it also benefits us strategically. Think of the Marshall Plan after World War II. We helped vulnerable European partners emerge from the rubble of that horrible war, and today they've become our most valuable trading partners, as well as our most valuable security partners. Think more recently about the 2014 Ebola crisis. We assisted the impacted countries, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Liberia. And we also helped contain the spread of Ebola, which protected Americans. So it's in our interests and consistent with our values to engage and to lead internationally. In addition, if America doesn't lead, other countries will. Countries like Russia and China. They'll fill the vacuum, as we've seen throughout history. And if that happens, our interests, our security, our economy, and the universal humanitarian principles that we in the West hold dear will all be undermined. So for these reasons, we want to ensure our federal government is prepared to play its international role as effectively as possible. Now, when I survey the federal government, like others before me, I see three primary legs of our national security stool: diplomacy, development, and defense. As someone who served in the U.S. Marine Corps, I recognize sometimes there's a tendency to focus on the defense leg to the disadvantage of the diplomatic and the development stools, if you will. But I believe neglecting or underfunding the development and diplomatic functions of our government is short-sighted, unwise, and will be dangerous. I'm, of course, not alone in that belief. As has been mentioned, USGLC has convened a National Security Advisory Council with 180-plus retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. In February, more than 120 of them sent a letter expressing their strong support for the international affairs budget. They wrote the following: "We know from our service in uniform that many of the crises our nation faces do not have military solutions alone." They continued, "The State Department, USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, and other development agencies are critical to preventing conflict and reducing the need to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way," unquote. Perhaps this is why General Jim Mad Dog Mattis, now our Secretary of Defense, when he was commander of the U.S. Central Command, famously said, "If you don't fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition." If we want to send our brave troops to war less often, and if we want to bring them home more quickly, we shouldn't starve our development and diplomacy efforts of the resources that they need. So for me, there's a clear value proposition to these investments in diplomacy and development. The Trump administration submitted a fiscal year 18 budget request that proposed deep cuts to the budgets of state and USAID. It would cut them by a third. I support the administration's desire to improve efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability, but seemingly arbitrary cuts to the Department of State and USAID would undermine these goals. The magnitude of the proposal, especially without first conducting the necessary strategic analysis, would do significant and, I believe, enduring damage to our diplomacy and development enterprises, not to mention the security, prosperity, and good that those efforts help achieve. So to ensure that my concerns and many of your concerns were heard, in April, along with Senator Durbin, I led an effort defending the International Affairs budget to the leaders of the Budget and Appropriations Committee. I had 43 U.S. senators who signed on to that letter, and frankly, it didn't, Liz, require a whole lot of effort to get their signatures. This is indeed an area ripe for continued bipartisan cooperation. I think it's fairly broadly understood within Congress that instead of hasty, arbitrary, and unwise cuts to diplomacy and development, we should first conduct strategic analysis from what I would call an ends, ways, and means perspective. In other words, we should identify in a rigorous way what we're trying to accomplish and then examine the tools available and the tools needed. Finally, we need to determine how to best invest our finite resources as effectively as possible. That's why I introduced with Senator Shaheen a National Diplomacy and Development Strategy Bill. And I'm pleased to report that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed a version of our legislation. And I'm going to continue to pursue this legislative priority until President Trump signs it into law. The kind of strategic analysis that Senator Shaheen and I would require this and future administrations to engage in should inform the reform and reorganization on an ongoing basis that we know is necessary at state and USAID. I also recently co-chaired a Center for Strategic and International Studies task force with Senator Shaheen. The title of that task force was Reforming and Reorganizing U.S. Foreign Assistance. This task force consisted of a bipartisan coalition of former Republican and Democratic officials, as well as retired senior foreign service officers and civil servants, representing about 30 of our nation's leading development experts. Within a very short period of time, at least by Washington standards, we produced a serious and substantive report that can guide reform and reorganization efforts going forward. In addition to ensuring our diplomacy and development are strategy-driven and our reform and reorganization efforts are well designed, we must also ensure that state and USAID are being held accountable. So I introduced another piece of legislation, bipartisan in nature, the Department of State and USAID Accountability Act of 2017. It simply requires state and USAID to implement our auditor, the General Accountability Office, their recommendations, or explain to Congress why they aren't being implemented. Now, it was puzzling to me when I started turning over rocks and kicking the tires of our development enterprise and our State Department that a number of these recommendations had not been acted upon for quite some time. But I think it's generally understood if the American people are going to continue to support development and diplomacy and all the funding that is associated with that, that our State Department and USAID need to be optimized. I've been using hearings, letters, and staff queries to push USAID to be more responsive on every front. And with a great leader like Mark Green, now at the helm of USAID, I really think that we're going to be able to make some headway in a significant fashion in the near future. So I'll just close before we begin the panel conversation and say that if we're going to build and sustain a broad, bipartisan, and durable coalition of support for robust investments in diplomacy and development and the international affairs budget more broadly, we have to be able to prove to skeptics that these programs are as efficient and well-run as possible. Moreover, we have to continue arguing that they're essential to our nation's freedom, security, and prosperity. So that's why, on your behalf, I've led some of these legislative efforts why I will continue to stay deeply engaged in these issues, and I look forward to working with many of you in that effort. Let's do some good together. God bless.
Hello?
Testing.
Wonderful.
I think we're on.
I would say that's a rock star in the making.
Thanks.
Gentlemen, please. That was fabulous. Let me get out of the way so you can get on. You know, when I think about Chairman Hamilton, Senator Lugar, Senator Young, there is something in the water here in Hoosier land. Wow. That was fabulous. We're going to welcome John, welcome Ambassador, onto the stage. We're going to have a great conversation. You need to be part of it. So a couple ground rules. Questions, you get to ask questions two different ways. You can tweet at USGLC and we will get your questions, so you can just sit there and do it the new way. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way, which sometimes I like to do it, and there are cards on the table. Write your questions. Our staff is going to come around and they will grab them, and you can join the conversation on Twitter, USGLCIN. Welcome. I'm going to pick up on three of your themes, and we'll go around as quickly as we can get as many in. And you talked about national security, economic, and kind of values, and I want to try to get around in on all of those. And I'll start with national security because you started with national security. And I'm thinking about, there are so many issues, North Korea, Syria, Afghanistan, and I was thinking about Afghanistan this week, obviously last week as the president announced his strategy. And one of the generals that I traveled most with was Jim Mattis before he became Secretary of Defense. And the question when I was moderated that I often asked him, and I'm going to go to the senator first on this question, is I often asked him about how many of you saw the movie Charlie Wilson's War? Do you remember it? For those that didn't raise their hand, Charlie Wilson's War is a former colleague, Chairman Hamilton, of yours. Representative Wilson fought very, very hard for the rebels against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and he was a little colorful congressman. But he, at the very end of that movie, when the Soviets lose, they're getting out of Afghanistan, and he goes to his fellow congressmen, and he says, we have won the war, the military has won, and he says, can we get about $1 million in today's world to do two things, to build roads and schools? And they laugh at him and said, what are you, the congressman from Kabul? And they don't spend the money. And Tom Ridge, the first Secretary of Defense, of Homeland Security, very close to us, said, what if? You know, what if? So you're a military guy, and you talked about national security. When I think about whether it's Afghanistan or any of these conflict-fragile places in the world, you talked about we're not investing in, should we be investing? What if, how do we do that prevention, that kind of, we do the military stuff right, but how do we make sure that we're doing it right when we put enough development and diplomacy in after some of these wars?
So, Charlie Wilson, if I recall, he had a military background.
Yes,
in fact,
he did.
Naval Academy graduate, I'm just saying.
He didn't have a Marine, is the point.
It may sound parochial, it's not intended to sound self-interested, but I think sometimes people who have served in the military, like the 180 generals and admirals who serve on your advisory council, recognize the limitations of military power because they've been there. Development and diplomacy and defense require distinct disciplines and skill sets. And we've learned in recent years that though our military can help consolidate gains, they're not optimized to do that. I use the phrase consolidate gains because H.R. McMaster has used this time and again every time I've heard him discuss development of a new national security strategy. He, of course, is our national security advisor to President Trump, and he recognizes that in recent years our men and women in uniform have done an outstanding job of what we ask of them, which is to win battles. But following those battles, we've been unable oftentimes to consolidate the gains, and that is the stuff of diplomacy and development. And so we don't want to continue to send men and women back into areas that have been won through great loss of our finest men and women in uniform, through great expenditures from our federal fisc, and with great attention from our civic life to the detriment of other areas that require attention. And so if we're going to avoid that, we need to consolidate those gains by ensuring we invest in development, roads, bridges, water treatment systems, education, and so forth, and that our military efforts are always done in furtherance of diplomatic ends. And that diplomatic effort actually begins before military conflict and endures after the fighting is ended.
So let me take that concept and ask you as Ambassador Feinstein, I'll get to your dean role, but I'm going to ask you first your diplomatic career. You had hands-on experience in this where the diplomats are working with the military. And since 9/11, there was really a shift between how the civilian and the military work together, this 3D strategy you described, development, diplomacy, and defense working together. Give us a window. How did the civilian and military work together when you were overseas?
Sure. I just have to say a word about Jim Morris, because he always says very nice things, but this afternoon he said I was rapidly becoming a Hoosier. That's the highest compliment I've received from him, and thank you very much. I'm one of those, I guess I'm part of the blob or the swamp, or however you want to define it.
We don't think of the diplomats as the swamp, so.
But I've worked inside government and outside government, and I've had the pleasure of working both at the State Department and the Defense Department. My first time in the government was for about 8 years in the 90s to the early 2000s. And when I started at the Defense Department, I worked in in an office called Strategy and Requirements, and we worked on what I guess we now call complex contingency operations, but there were lots of different names that people bandied about. But it was the office that was trying to deal with all of these really complex military operations which have become so familiar to us. I worked in the Pentagon. It was a terrific opportunity, and I got a phone call from the Deputy Secretary of State, Jim Steinberg. He said, "Hey, how would you like to go work at the State Department?" And I thought about it. I wasn't so sure. I talked to my colleagues at the Joint Staff, and I did accept the job at the State Department. And this guy from the Joint Staff, I'll never forget, called me up one morning and said, "So I hear you're joining the enemy." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The State Department." And that was a very kind of, he was kidding, of course. But that was there was a lot of stovepiping in those years. But when I came back into the government, which was in late 2008, early 2009, one of the things that I noticed was that that's really no longer the case, and certainly not for the best people who are in the Pentagon and at the State Department, because they have worked so closely together. I guess it's the 9/11 generation, but also maybe the post-Balkan generation, who really understand that, of course, military force is essential to advancing our interests. But just as the senator said, it's only a part of the picture. So I had people when I was ambassador who came to my post having served in State Department roles with the military, for example, in Iraq, not in the green zone, but in some of the most dangerous areas, extending their tours, working not for the 6-month rotation, but extending to 18 months. The person who did this, by the way, she became my political economic advisor and clearly one of my MVPs in the mission. And on the other side, my Air Force attaché, she was somebody who I felt comfortable putting in any kind of diplomatic role, another very mission-driven person. So I guess to your point, Liz, it is maybe not evident to people, but I think inside the government, and certainly for the people who get it and are the most successful, and I think it's very much encouraged now in the Defense Department, in the State Department, in USAID and elsewhere, that people really need to work together in order to advance the mission.
Fascinating. I think it's probably what both of you are saying, why, at least from our point of view, the military is one of the strongest advocates, and we see it even with those in uniform today, that when every combat commander came out in support of the budgets just even this year. We'll come into national security. I'm sure you have questions about it, but I want to get to the economy. We all know the term, it's the economy, stupid, and get John in it and ask the senator a question. I think about Lando, you're not the stupid one. You're the one who's going to answer this question, because Land O'Lakes, as Jim said, you're this incredible company, and I see you're in 13 countries around international development work all over the world. And I personally have been to one of your international development programs in Eldoret, Kenya, seeing a dairy co-op where you're helping lift farmers out of poverty. It was an incredible program, helping millions of people. The question I have is why? I mean, you can go into emerging markets and you can just invest doing the old marketing programs, but here you're doing international development works that I introduced Mark before. What's the return on investment of why a company like Land O'Lakes is doing this?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that we are kind of a unique company in this regard. All of you, I assume, in the room, or at least I hope so, know us for our commercial businesses, our for-profit activities. I ran our dairy foods business for the better part of 10 years on the for-profit side, the Inc. side of Land O'Lakes, if you will. Some of you in the room, certainly some of you, might know that we have also been doing development work around the globe for the better part of 40 years. So the company's been around for roughly 100 years. We've been doing development work for about 40 years. Over that period of time, we've done around 300 different programs in 80 different countries, in a number of different parts of the world, Eastern Europe, Central and South America. Now a lot of our activities are in Africa, East Africa in particular, and also in South Asia. The question of why, to be honest, the start of the work that we've done in international development came from our owners. We're a farmer-owned cooperative, including owners who may be in the room today. We have a fairly significant agribusiness presence in Indiana. But we defined the neighborhood quite broadly back in the early 1980s. And a number of our owners went to the board of our company and said, we'd like to take part in helping raise the fortunes, helping farmers in other countries do the right thing, because we know that's what it takes to be successful. It very much mirrors the start of our company back in 1921 when 300 dairy farmers in central Minnesota got together and said, we can do more together than we can do apart. Let's find a way to work together to reach new populations, to raise all boats, if you will. And that's very much the kind of spirit that motivated our work in international development. I think more recently, Liz, the opportunities that we see through that lens of having done development around the world point out or help us to see the economic opportunities for our business. So it's not just doing the right thing. It's not just humanitarian thinking, though that is where it started. It really comes down to saying, how do we continue to do that? And then how do we look for opportunities for the commercial side of our business to help raise those fortunes of people in those countries as well.
And we're seeing this same with companies. I was just in Georgia with Senator Perdue on Friday, and Coca-Cola was on the panel and said very, very similar things. And so I would ask an Indiana question to Senator Young. I saw that 8,500 Hoosier companies depends on exports for their businesses, and I think we talked about it in the opening. And 85% of them are small and medium-sized businesses. And can you talk about one of the major challenges? You actually mentioned it, is the competitive marketplace. You go to Africa and you see China. They're spending 780% increase on international development. So talk a little bit about, are we doing enough with our development and diplomacy to make sure we're doing the competitive programs to make sure we're helping those 8,500 companies?
Clearly, we could be doing more. Right, 95% of the world's consumers outside of the United States, small, medium-sized enterprises, disproportionately benefit from development expenditures overseas. That's at a time, it should be noted, when most jobs here in the United States are no longer being created by our young firms, by our family firms, which has historically been the case. We suffer from a lack of dynamism for a lot of reasons as compared to a generation or two ago in this country. So we should be removing every obstacle and catalyzing every opportunity we can for people to start new businesses. So certainly is really important. I'd also like to emphasize, you don't have to go too far in Indiana to have to experience a manifestation of the importance of our relationships with countries overseas and investors overseas. You go up to Lafayette, you have Subaru Isuzu. Thousands of Hoosiers are employed by that great company. Princeton, it's Toyota. Greensburg, it's Honda. That's just the auto manufacturers. So you could go through sector after sector of Indiana's economy, and that's the case. You talk to our farmers. They want us to continue to open markets overseas. We remain the most manufacturing intensive state in the entire country, and our manufacturers oftentimes will only grow if we continue to grow foreign markets. And then there's the human capital dimension to forging those stronger relationships. So Indiana University, a school I'm quite familiar with because I live in Bloomington, as do you, Lee, and I know from speaking to students on campus that so many of them now participate in foreign exchange programs in a way that when I went to school we didn't. And moreover, it's the foreign students who attend our great universities and our college system who help subsidize our own citizens' ability to develop the skills to participate meaningfully in a 21st century economy. So there's just a constellation of reasons out there why continued investment of a small portion of our overall federal budget it makes sense, not just from a security and philanthropic standpoint, but also in order to grow our economy.
Yeah, no, it's so impressive listening to a number of you about what you're doing. You mentioned the students, and maybe now I'll put the dean hat back on you and ask you a student question, because that was an interesting sentence. I saw a statistic that last year nearly 30,000 international students enrolled in Indiana schools, and they calculate that's just under $1 billion to the Indiana economy. So I wonder if it just made me think about the student side. What is happening with students in terms of the energy and the interest in America's role in the world, the topic we're talking about today? You're starting this incredible school at IU. What's happening?
Well, thank you. Well, we're growing, and we're growing because of it just has to be said, we're very fortunate to be in a state which has this great global tradition and a bipartisan support for American leadership, and that's where it all begins. And then Indiana University has this long history. We teach, as Jim Morris said, 84 languages on campus, which is more than anybody else. I guess you could say that if there's a silver lining in the bad international news we're seeing, it's good for my enrollments. It's good for business, but the students come in, they're, I would say, pragmatic, they are non-ideological, and they're also a little idealistic. They want to do the right thing. And I think that's a good combination. And they want to do something that sets them apart a little bit from others. So they're frequently studying languages maybe that certainly I didn't study when I was entering, like Mandarin or Arabic. We've got, and the U.S. government supporting us in that. The Defense Department gives us money to teach at a high level courses in Turkish, in Mandarin, and Arabic, because they're strategic languages and because it's important. And, just more broadly, and again, Jim said this, there's no career now that isn't global. Whatever field you're in, you need to feel comfortable in the world and working in different cultures and having skills. And so our students are really motivated by that, and they're coming in larger numbers as a consequence.
I want to connect the motivation of the students with something, Senator, you said in your comments. You've been amazing in 6 months in trying to bring awareness to the famine crisis, the humanitarian crisis. We mentioned in the introduction what you did in the letter. You also raised it about getting the UN to try to do something. And with your help and a lot of others, there is an emergency aid package of $900 million for famine relief. And so on behalf of all of us, thank you for what you're doing to bring real attention and money to this issue. Now my worry, and this is going back to the awareness, There's a poll I just saw that showed that 85% of Americans are unaware of the scale of this famine crisis. So my question is, how do we do a better job? You were fighting it in Congress, you were fighting it at the UN, but how do we do a better job of making our fellow Americans, we're kind of a select group that we all care about America's role in the world, but making Americans aware when there's the Haiti earthquake, half of American households responded. We're a generous society, but this is really concerning.
Yeah, this is arguably the worst humanitarian crisis in my lifetime, yet very few of my neighbors are even aware of it. Most Hoosiers, through no fault of their own, have never heard of Yemen, which is the worst of the 4 countries that are experiencing this famine. And what's really tragic about the situation, and I know is not broadly understood, is each of these 4 famines are to varying degrees, but each of these 4 famines are man-made, as opposed to a result of natural disasters. So there's a moral imperative for us to act. There's also a national security imperative. Think of Yemen. We have a minority group, the Houthis, who happen to be Shia Muslim. Very few of them are actually radicalized. The Iranians are on the ground. Al-Qaeda, which is Sunni in its religious followings, they're on the ground. They're the ones that sponsored the underwear bomber, and arguably the most dangerous of the Al-Qaeda franchise. And so the failure for the international community for the longest time to facilitate the delivery of food and medicine and other necessary aid to the Houthis will lead invariably to the radicalization of Houthis that wouldn't otherwise be radicalized. Their alignment with people who want to do us harm. Further destabilization of what is already, many would argue, a failed state. And so, in order for these things to be broadly understood, yes, elected officials like myself need to continue to speak out about these things. But this is where all of you can be social, political antibodies. If you are leaders, by definition, you are here, you are leaders, and so many of you occupy incredibly important positions in business, in government, and in our community. So if we can engage folks like you to share with others the importance of doing whatever we can to mitigate, remediate, and address these situations, then I think that's really an answer to your question. How we can ensure that moving forward, we continue to keep these sorts of things front of mind.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions that picked up on your reform, making aid effective. And I want to start, I have a question for each of you on that. So I'm going to pull some of these questions together if some of you don't mind. Innovation. Innovation is part of the way public-private partnerships has been part of the way that we're getting more bang for the buck. Land O'Lakes was really involved in leading on global food security around public-private partnerships in Feed the Future. And with, government put a little funding in and private sector came in. Can you talk about how Land O'Lakes is working with U.S. government? Because one of the questions I always get is, in these global development problems, why doesn't the private sector just take care of it? What is it that government can do that they can only do, and what is it that private sector can do?
That's a terrific question.
Why don't you guys just do it all?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is the private sector is doing a lot. And many people probably don't realize that if you turn the clock back to 1961 and the Foreign Assistance Act that gave rise to a lot of the groups that are now the instruments of our foreign affairs activities, 70% of the money that was flowing into developing countries came from foreign assistance or USG funding. Now, today, that level globally is down to like 13%. In the United States, it's under 10%. The balance of the funding going into developing countries comes from direct investment by private sector organizations through philanthropic organizations, and also through remittances of money going back into those countries from people based in the U.S. and elsewhere. So the fact of the matter is the private sector is highly involved and engaged in development. And often, and I've heard this as I'm relatively new to my role in development at Land Lakes, and as I've gone out and met with some of our funders from USAID or USDA or the Gates Foundation or others, what I have learned is there's an ever stronger belief that we aren't going to be able to solve the development challenges we face unless and until we effectively engage the private sector. In whatever country you're talking about, in whatever vertical you're talking about, mine is agribusiness, but there are certainly others. If we don't engage the private sector, both locally and the transnational corporations, that many of whom are part of Liz's group, the chances of spending the same dollar twice go up quite a bit. I'm owned by farmers. If there's one thing they don't like, it's spending the same dollar twice. The engagement of the private sector in innovative approaches, in taking advantage of those things that, frankly, only the U.S. government can bring, like the convening power of pulling together the faith communities, pulling together the local civil society or the local governments, pulling together the NGOs that have the expertise, and then pulling in all of the private sector engagement who bring technical understanding, investment, expertise. It's only through the U.S. government, frankly, that we can get those kinds of things done. But it's important that everyone realizes, in the networks that you influence, that the private sector is highly engaged in development today. It is not all on the backs of the taxpayer.
It's a good point. Mark Green, who's becoming the U.S. aid administrator, was the ambassador to Tanzania, and he used to say you could create a free trade agreement today with Tanzania and would do nothing because they don't have land rights. Right. And so you have to, there's some things only government do. One of the questions on the same reform on this catalyst is catalyst of the private sector. It's also catalyst to multinational, to our allies. Can you talk, Lee, how does, in these humanitarian crises that Senator Young was just talking, the conflicts that are out there, how important is it to also have the U.S. be a catalyst to push other countries? The president has been talking quite a bit about that.
Well, Senator Young said this, when the United States doesn't lead, others fill in the space, or nothing good happens. And so it's not always obvious, but in the absence of American leadership, it's very, very hard to make progress. And you can see this across the board. And so, in my own experience, for example, diplomacy helps to build coalitions. The United States can't do everything on its own, nor should it do everything on its own. Well, it's the diplomats who help to build the teams that contribute to it. So, for example, in just my own experience in Warsaw, we were able to get Polish troops to take part in the U.S. effort in Afghanistan. It was not the Afghanistan war was less popular in Poland than it was even in the United States. So that's kind of a hard sell. But that's what diplomats are supposed to do. Also, in the part of the world in Central and Eastern Europe, we've got some real challenges, obviously, on Russia's border. We have Russian intervention in Ukraine. What's the best way to deal with that? Well, the best way to deal with it is to help Ukraine build a stronger society, a less corrupt society, an economically promising society. And the United States plays a really critical role in doing that, in working with the Ukrainians on government reform, on good governance, on democracy assistance, and also stimulating U.S. investment in Ukraine in order to build a stronger and more resilient Ukraine, which is the best way, the best bulwark against Russian meddling in that country.
Can I ask, Senator, you talked about you're leading these incredible efforts then to take some of these reforms to really change and make sure we're getting it right. And if we had been sitting here 10 years ago 80% of our humanitarian aid would have been responding to natural disasters.
Yeah.
Today, 80% of our humanitarian aid is going to conflict in fragile states. By 2030, 2 billion people on this earth are going to be living in conflict in fragile states. So getting it right is going to be figuring out how do we not just do our humanitarian aid in places that are safe and calm, but are dealing in these conflict states that Lee just talked about. How are you dealing with that in your, I was on the CSI task force, how do you think about that when you think about getting aid right? Because these are tough places, and I know you travel.
You know, my favorite founding father in so many ways is Ben Franklin. And, you know, he said time and again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So this follows that sort of lodestar, if you will. We need to always keep that in mind so that we're preventing future conflicts, preventing the deployment of U.S. troops and then of our allies, preventing, frankly, a far greater expenditure, not just in terms of risk and loss of human life, but financial expenditure for reactive use of military force, and then the attendant diplomacy and development expenditures that always seem to have to come with that. But I think one could distill my answer to your question into General Mattis's thoughts when he was head of CENTCOM, when he said that if we don't fully fund our State Department, then he's going to have to buy more ammunition. I think that resonates. It's something that certainly has resonated with fellow Hoosiers. They get that. I think more broadly, the American people do. We just need leaders, and I use that term generally to include those of us who happen to be elected to something, but everyone in this room, to continue to make this important argument to our peers during a time when, frankly, there's a threat to the international affairs budget.
So before we wrap up for the final question, Hoosier messaging. I'm going to ask the newest Hoosier message. You know, we've talked about messaging a lot over the years, and what resonates? You know, you lived in Washington, you lived overseas, Lee. What is the connection? And we've been talking on stage about this a lot, and I think that's one of the challenges. I look at polling, and I see that the polling goes back and forth. Americans seem to connect, many and most, that we have to be engaged in the world, but they question how do they benefit from it.
Before you answer that, could I just interject really quickly? You know, Jim, you're making him wait. I don't know what he has to do to qualify as a Hoosier, but you know.
Did he go through the right? You know?
I'm going to tell you right now. You've just become a Hoosier. All right, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just broadening out a little bit. I mean, in the United States, you know, we have a problem, right? We're facing some of the most difficult problems probably at any time since the end of World War II. And there's less consensus in the United States about how to address them. That's why your panel is called America's Role in the World, because it's a contentious issue. So it's really very difficult. And just more broadly, not particularly here, but more broadly, we've got to do a better job of global education. You asked about students. The students are very globally minded. They are also idealistic, and those are great things. But one thing they don't have any personal experience of is exactly what we're doing here, what your video showed so well, is they have no personal experience of nonpartisanship or bipartisanship. And that leads to a lot of cynicism, and you know, it's not all founded, but there's also some reason for them to feel that way as well. And this is something really important for us to work on and to model and to show them how much is actually being done together, but also to do better in working together and to give them some examples. You know, back in the day, you know, how did you get a bill done? Well, the way Senator Young is doing it now. You found a Democrat and a Republican, they got together, they got a bunch of people to sign it, and then you got it through. And we had an event that Senator Young took part in on campus last December to mark the 25th anniversary of the Nunn-Lugar non-proliferation legislation, which was legislation to deal with the loose nukes problem following the end of the Cold War. And it was a terrific panel. I was a little worried that it was going to be dry, but it turned out to be very, very interesting, but for reasons I didn't fully expect, which was that the students came up to me in a crowd afterwards and said, wait a second, you mean that there was this guy, who was it, Sam Nunn, was he a senator? Sam Nunn and Senator Lugar, and they worked together on a difficult national security issue to pass legislation, and it worked? And this was a revelation to many of them. So this is, I think, really important, but I think it also speaks to the importance and value of what we're all doing here.
Senator,
today.
when you go when you go around to your constituents, not necessarily in rooms, do you get a lot of questions? Is it North Korea? Is it Afghanistan? Is it what's happening in Syria? Is it explaining why we're engaged in the world, or is it really dominated by domestic priorities?
In the main, I hear about domestic priorities. It's jobs, it's the economy, it's wages, it's the issue of upward mobility, lack of new business startups. It's those sorts of things, which is not an Indiana-specific issue. It's not an America-specific issue, as we've discussed, right? It really is a global issue. So I strive to try and frame those issues wherever possible within a global context. But I am increasingly asked, seeing as there's so many major conflicts around the world or potential conflicts, about the state of things. And so I try and bring those home and make those accessible to Hoosiers as well. Oftentimes it's referencing the men and women in uniform from this state that have deployed overseas and made the ultimate sacrifice. You know, unfortunately, I attended yet another funeral on Saturday in Columbus. We had a fellow Hoosier who fell in Afghanistan recently, and so Hoosiers get that. We're good people, and we want to avoid that wherever possible. In order to avoid that, it takes a partnership between the private sector, our not-for-profits, and our federal government.
So let me ask each of you, if you would, to close out, is all of three of you have traveled the world in different ways. And I believe that the way we connect to those that don't travel the world is we tell stories. And if you could each share maybe one story from your travels of how you see America Global Leadership having that impact, that will both give us an insight into you and leave us as a community remembering how this connects. As the senator said, our topic is America's global leadership and how leading globally matters locally. I will share with you that after them, there is a role for each of us. And I'm going to ask the audience for a role for you. So you can't get up right when we leave. There's just a 2-minute closing that I want to share. So John,
sure.
Where have you been?
I've been many places in the last handful of months, but the one that strikes me the most is an experience I had 2 years ago when I was in Rwanda. We were talking about conflict states. Rwanda, with its genocide in the early 1900s, early 1990s, was an absolutely devastated place. And our firm was called in to do some work on behalf of USAID to help build the dairy sector. In a lot of the countries that we do work in, upwards of 80% of the population are engaged in agriculture. So ag development has a unique power to lift people's fortunes in these countries. And so over a number of years, 2 successive engagements, we really helped to build a vibrant dairy sector in a country that has become something of the shining star of growth in the African continent. And what I was able to see was Agnes, a farmer who had became highly successful in adding 2 more cows, employed people, was able then to raise quality standards for her and the cooperative that she helped to form, engaged new relationships with processors to turn her cow's milk into more value-added products, higher price profit that brought vitality back to her family and her community. And then our project had, part of its challenge was to help develop dairy consumption within Rwanda. So we helped to create stores where people could come in and get fresh, safe milk every day in a way that could not have happened before. So it was a great example to me of seeing how American investment, this case through USAID, in partnership with many others, including local private sector companies, were able to truly make a difference in people's lives. And that's just one small example. There are many, many. There are a lot of NGOs in the room, I think, who could tell you versions of the same kind of idea.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Lee.
Well, I'll tell the international story, but from the perspective of here, and briefly, which is every year I get to welcome Fulbright students who come into the United States, and Bloomington hosts a big group of them. And I now ask them where they're from. And it's fantastic, the range of people who are studying here. Last year I asked, I just let them raise their hand and see who volunteers. The second person who raised her hand was a woman. I said, well, where are you from? She said, I'm from Lebanon. And I said, well, why are you studying here? She said, I came to study in the United States because I want to study human rights, and that's not something I can do at home.
Fantastic, fantastic. She is lucky, a lucky lady. Senator.
Two very brief stories. I visited Saudi Arabia, was sitting down with some other United States representatives at the time, with the intelligence chief of their government. And this may have been a missed opportunity, but he emphasized America must lead. America must lead. If you do not lead, then Iran will develop nuclear weapons capability, and we will be forced to do the same. It was very direct. That would take a troubling sectarian conflict to a nuclear level. That has always stayed with me. But what I actually think about periodically before I go to bed at night was an interaction with a young boy in Afghanistan. It was a military hospital out in a barren area of Afghanistan. We were touring the facilities. I was so proud of what we Americans were doing, not just to help out our own soldiers and our partners in that military conflict which endures, but also to help out the local population. I saw a little boy in the corner. I asked if it would be appropriate for me to go over and speak with him. His father was standing next to him. The little boy had no legs. The Taliban had engineered an improvised explosive device. The boy was out playing, lost his legs, lost many fingers on one hand, and learned some about his situation. And his father said through a translator, because we were caring for his child, we were going to provide a wheelchair for this child to get around for the rest of his life. America, God bless you. And we all started crying. Our leadership does matter. It really does matter. From a security standpoint, from an economic standpoint, but in terms of advancing our values as well. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please thank not only Lee, John, but Senator Young.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Great to meet you.
Pretty special, and that's why I need you. The thing about USTLC is we ask all of you, not for money, but we ask you for your voice. And we have a wonderful colleague I have, Will McEntee, who put this all together. So thank you, Will. And every now and then you get emails from Will, and you get emails from me. And when we email you, we try to give you information, but we also ask you every now and then, not a lot, and we ask you to thank your policymakers. Because what Senator Young, Senator Donnelly, and the other members of the delegation do, and Chairman Hamilton did for a long time, is not easy. And it's not easy to go to Washington and lead. And we've talked a lot about that today. And we ask you one thing, to say thank you. So don't think that they don't want to hear thank you, because this is really hard. So when he goes out and does all the things we've just talked about today, and you get an email from one of us that says, hey, right now, write a note and say this issue is important to you, or write a note and say one of the members or Senator Young just did something, say thank you. So that's number one. Number two is join the conversation. If you're on social media, Twitter, Facebook, join us and really amplify, just like we talked about the famine, just like we talked about refugee, whatever the issue is, there's a lot of issues that are going on. We got to make some noise. Third, if you are a veteran, you stood up, get more veterans involved. They are, some of the military is some of the best messengers we've had. We've talked about it. And every June, we bring as many people as we can to Washington so you can meet with your delegation there and to make some noise in Washington. Next year, it's going to be June 18th and 19th, and we want you there. And I would just end with this. In just the last few months, I had the privilege of going with CARE, which is one of our board members, one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world, to Nepal. And I, like some of the stories we're told here, I met a woman named Sita. And Sita told a story of how she, through USAID, lived in complete poverty, and she showed us this little plot of land that was, she told me, was completely barren before USAID showed up, and now she's like booming with cabbage, which I saw. And she told me how pleased she was that now, because of this co-op that she was involved in, that she and the women in her village now were able to get out of poverty. And she was so impressed and so proud of it. But that's not what really touched my heart. What was so unbelievable is, if you know anything about Nepali women, they are often left in their home, and there is enormous domestic violence. And what she said to us is that because of this program, before, she uses her words, they were flesh and bones, and today they have a voice, and she said they are now humans because of America. And she literally reached over to my arm, and she wanted to introduce me to her friend because of this program, who is now running for office. So these programs do more than just lift people up of poverty. They give voice, they give hope. You heard 3 amazing stories. You met 3 amazing voices. Thank you for joining us today.
Good job, Annette.
Good to see you.
I'll see you around town.